Do you care how many views you get on your videos?
No.
And why is that?
Who cares? How does it matter? Whoever needs to experience this frequency and vibration by the grace of their own vibration will probably manifest this experience, this teaching or this information transmission, whatever, whichever way they take it, whichever way they're able to perceive it. So this will be a part of their experience. Yeah.
And how seriously do you take it? Do you see it as a responsibility that you are doing this, or what is your approach? Do you have a different approach?
It's a selfless service, so it doesn't really matter. It's a selfless service. You cannot deliver or offer something authentic if you don't maintain that authenticity within yourself. You cannot maintain that frequency if you aren't authentic yourself. So the whole point of spiritual teaching or spiritual sharing or whatever you call it lies in this emanation. So the point is not that there is a teaching here and there is someone else there. It's the emanation of what you are. So everyone emanates their essence or their being or their trauma or their ego. So whatever you emanate, that is that. And there can be a lot of beings who do not resonate with a certain frequency, so it's not a part of their experience. The frequency itself attracts or repels. It's by the frequency that we experience certain things, we become a part of something. If we cultivate that frequency within ourselves, we come across a certain frequency. If we are capable of recognizing this frequency within ourselves, we will be able to see beyond the physical realm, the frequency of the spiritual teaching or emanation. If we're incapable, we won't be able to understand or resonate or even sort of decipher what that is. So everyone is an emanation. Spiritual teaching is self-protected, true knowledge is self-protected by the degree, by the frequency level. And so there's no worry about how many people come across it or are keen on it or are interested in experiencing, or maybe they're temporarily interested. Maybe it's a matter of curiosity, but curiosity does not lead to the pursuit. We pursue something when we discover it within ourselves. So if we discover that frequency, even to the point of just 1% or less, we will gradually discover more of it within ourselves, or we will be interested in pursuing it, cultivating it within ourselves. And so sooner or later, we will come across similar frequency in the external world.
And so being authentic in that way means that then your message is clear in that sense, that you're not adding in all sorts of tangents that may be of interest to people who may not gain so much from the message, from the core message. And then they may get distracted by all of these added values that people can add to their message. That can be the message that some people pick up is the bells and whistles rather than that core just being?
I already answered. I mean, is it a statement or a question? The thing is that we are at the moment, we live in the age of superficiality. So people attract to superficiality, even if they perceive somewhere, somewhat their essence, they're still wrapped up in superficiality. And so there's always a superficial dimension, there's always a bodily dimension, there's always a physical dimension there. The question here is, can anyone go beyond it? Can they perceive beyond? So if someone perceives beyond, they can, see things through, understand things beyond the physical dimension. If they can't understand or perceive things beyond the physical dimension, there is no point even of speaking about spirituality or spiritual teachings, because spiritual teaching is always a powerful transmission beyond the physical realm, or which is still relevant in the physical realm. So that type of frequency. And so when people experience some kind of energy movements, or they are just discovering that first layer of their subtle being, you may say, or dimension, so they cannot kind of see beyond that frequency. So if they've discovered something beyond that frequency, then they can relate to higher forms of teaching and transmission. And that's why it's irrelevant to speak about who comes, who views, how many people. It's irrelevant. If I were to just express my personal understanding about how many people would understand higher forms of teaching, it probably would be less than fingers in one hand. And so, yes, we are at the moment observing the phenomenon of, you may say, spiritual interest outburst, or people are interested to learn certain things, but the way they understand spirituality is still through the physical realm, through the realm of emotions, mental forms, intellect. So they cannot bypass this level. And that's why the spirituality they get attracted to, or they manifest, or they understand, or can comprehend, has to either be wrapped up in that paradigm of their understanding, or has to have elements, mediums through which they would understand something. But even then, they usually pay attention at the wrappers rather than the essence. So the essence remains sort of self-protected as the higher forms of knowledge. Sometimes we may experience, let's say, blissful states, or we can experience some kind of forms of spiritual knowledge, but because it is not our constant frequency, we cannot either sustain it within ourselves for long, or we try to explain it to ourselves, to our logical mind, trying to wrap it up in some sort of conditioning, in some sort of form. And that's one of the biggest traps on the spiritual path, on the authentic, true spiritual path, beyond names and forms and known teachings and schools and streams of knowledge. And this is where we tend to create a sense of self through every experience, through every piece of knowledge or information, and this is called ego. So we entrap ourselves willingly, because we cannot just allow experience allow being, allow the flow. We're rigid, and this rigidity becomes our own self-created trap, our own imprisonment, spiritual imprisonment, because whatever we experience, we need to box, we need to explain. Most of our quests are driven by the desire to explain. We look for someone to validate us, to acknowledge our experiences, to bring us to this thought that we've achieved something. And this is the trap in and of itself. We can't understand that life is a constant flow, and we're not supposed to look at every element within this flow. If we do, we block ourselves, we stagnate. So we stress maybe. So we create the draining of it, or the situation where we drain our energy. To be in the flow means to be the flow. To be in the natural being means to be the natural being. To be in yoga means to be yoga. It means one and the same thing. And this is the part of natural spirituality, where you are just in the flow. You observe different elements, but you're not constantly creating a sense of self or an identity about whatever experience you have, or whatever. You don't focus on the experiences of other people either. So there's no dimension of comparison, envy, jealousy. So if those dimensions are there, you will always try to separate yourself from the flow, create some kind of artificial boundary which will define your limited self, and which will create so-called individuation, or the sense of individual self, ego. And you will always try to explain your existence. You will try to explain your spiritual experiences. You will hold on to things which are still temporary, even if they are of spiritual nature. And this will be the trap in itself. Only those are true adepts of life, true adepts of natural spirituality, who allow themselves to surrender to the true flow. And to surrender means understanding what makes one content, how this contentment originates within oneself, and how one may hold on to this balance and contentment through whatever the external circumstances are, or whatever you come across. You still hold on to that sense of natural being, or perception of the natural being. And many people ask, how do you define the natural flow from the flow of life? You cannot, because the flow of life is that what you are. If you are agony, if you're emanation of contradictive emotions, it tells you that you are going against the flow. You're not within the flow. You are experiencing a corrupt flow, and you have to recognize it. How to understand it? Because it gives you pain, it gives you suffering, you may say. How do you define suffering? It's painful. It's painful on some level. If it's not painful on the physical level, then it's very painful on an emotional or mental level. And so when you go against the natural flow, you naturally experience pain, because you are not able at that moment to surrender. So you're trying to control. What is opposite to the natural flow is control, is desire to control, to be in control, to have this false sense of I'm in charge. I navigate my life. I create my life. Until you are in the natural flow, you don't create anything. All you experience is the corruption of the self, which is constantly compulsively, obsessively emanating out of you and reflecting back to you. So that's the current flow. You may move these emotions around, you may choose sometimes to manipulate these emotions, and you believe that it's a creative process. This is not a creative process. You have to purify yourself, refine yourself, so that certain emotions can become your creative tools, like pure anger or pure love and compassion. Anger may set boundaries, but also may curse, may create negative transmission and distortion within the projected reality. The same goes with love and compassion. It becomes a blessing. So at the moment, the majority of people chaotically transmit themselves. And they're not actually transmitting their true selves, they're transmitting their vulnerable, traumatized, emotionally disturbed selves, unfortunately. And so the point of spiritual learning becomes to, first of all, balance oneself, which is, in other words, healing oneself, realizing own traumas, occult, negative undercurrents, emotional, traumatic responses that have been either transmitted or from the past life or inherited from the current life circumstances and situations. So, and that's why the level of spirituality in this day and age at this point is rather focused on emotions and thoughts and the physical body. So it's a bodily spirituality. It's an emotional spirituality, which has nothing to do with the knowledge of reality and the reality of, with a capital R, the ultimate reality or the higher levels of reality, knowledge, awareness, and understanding. So that's all.